Okay, our speaker today is Dr. William Van Lear. Bill lives in the Villages. He's a professor emeritus from Belmont Abbey College. He got his undergrad in economics from Gettysburg College, his PhD in economics from Pittsburgh. He was a full-time tenured professor, and he's written several books, and he's active down here. So we had a little bit of a glitch today with the doctor he lost his internet due to a lightning strike. So we've got him dialed in, and so he's going to be talking by phone. So are you there, doctor?
I am.
Okay, then with that, I'll let you take it away.
All right, thank you. Good to be with everybody. I've had a series of little personal mishaps, losing internet and among some other things. But thanks to Mike and others there that helped me to get connected today, and I can be with you by phone. In terms of what we're going to talk about here briefly, maybe a 12 to 15-minute presentation and then some questions, is the issue of the national debt. This is not only a controversial issue, but it's often a confusing one for a lot of people. So what we want to try to do today is create some clarity around this topic so that you'll feel better thinking about it and can debate or discuss with other people this issue and related topics with some confidence. So I'm going to provide here a five-part presentation, but the back half is really the main part because that gets into the principles that you need to understand in order to engage in this topic in a way that, again, that you feel comfortable. I'm going to first give you the answer to the question, should we worry about the national debt? So you already have it at the beginning of the talk, and the answer is no. And then we're going to get into some background, and Amy's going to bring up some slides for you to take a look at. And then after we do the background pretty quickly, then we get into 5 basic principles. And those are the things that you need to know and to comprehend to engage in some debate. And then after that, for whatever time might remain, I can take questions. Feel free to make statements, or if you want to send me an email later this week once my internet is back up, I'll be more than happy to respond that way as well. And in the last slide, you'll also see some references that you can go to. So you'll see one on the side that supports the importance of having a national debt, that there's positive aspects to that, and then a more critical tone coming from the second reference. So let's go to the slides here. All right. Amy, the slide here begins with the answer to the question, should we worry about the national debt? I think the answer to that is no. Most people seem to really worry about this, but we're going to try to present an argument with a set of principles that will, I think, relax you on this, and this is not something to fear or to be concerned about in terms of future generations or anything in terms of the contemporary period. So hopefully we're going to do that for you. So Amy, the next slide on the cash flow. All right, well, let's define a few terms here. Everybody's got a cash flow, and by cash flow, we simply mean the difference between somebody's spending and their income. So you could have a positive cash flow, and that would mean that your income is actually higher than your spending. A negative cash flow would be the opposite, when somebody would be spending more than their income. And then if you have a balanced budget or a balanced cash flow, then your spending would equal your income. Everybody's got a cash flow, businesses, households, workers, as well as the government. Everybody spends and everybody's got an income. Deficit is the term that we typically give to a negative cash flow. And it's often not associated typically with private spenders. Usually in that situation, it's just called a negative cash flow. But if the government's running a deficit, what they have is a negative cash flow. So the government would be spending more than it's taking in tax revenue. So its spending would be higher than its income. The positive cash flow, again, of course, would be where the income exceeds the spending. So everybody's got an income, everybody spends, so everybody has a cash flow, and that should take us then to the next slide, Amy, on deficits. I mentioned a moment ago, usually the term deficit is associated with government finance as opposed to a household or a business, but the deficit is in reference to a negative cash flow. So that would be when the government is spending more than its tax revenue, and that's a typical situation for a national government, much less so for a state or a city, but most national governments throughout the world will typically run deficit budgets or a negative cash flow. So in the case of the national government, when it runs consecutive yearly deficits, that's what then creates the debt. The debt is simply the accumulated deficits. Okay, again, the debt is simply the accumulated deficits. And that would be the case, too, for a private individual or a business. But again, typically the word deficit is associated with public finance. So let's now go to the next slide. And here you see some figures. Let's take a look at those. Now, the national debt stands at a pretty big number, 28 trillion, and that's gone up a lot just in the last 3 years, right? With the 2018 tax cut, also the higher spending that came out of the Trump administration in defense and some other areas. And then with the onset of COVID, right? And we had a big COVID package in 2020, and we got another one in 2021. And there may be more spending coming down the line with infrastructure and green energy, hopefully something like that. The size that the Biden administration is proposing, something up in the $2.2 trillion range, somewhere in there will hopefully get passed. So there have been pressures driving up the national debt here rather remarkably in the last 3 years. Federal spending comes in around $6 trillion. The federal revenue is about $3 trillion, right? So the gap there would be the deficit or the negative cash flow with $3 trillion. That would be a deficit budget. And I have a GDP figure there for you at 21 trillion. So the economy is very large itself. That's the GDP is how much the economy produces yearly. And that makes us the largest economy by about $7 trillion. China is second and Japan is third. So notice that the national debt is now above GDP, and that's only occurred in the last 3 to 4 years. The national debt had been around GDP or a little below it. All right, that's the background. All right, now let's go to the main part of the conversation today. So Amy, go to the next slide that begins there with private debt is large. So I got 3 principles here, 3 of 5 principles that I want you to come to understand. The first is that simply that the private debt itself is large. Often the conversation about national debt is only about federal government debt. That's a legitimate topic, but there's debt that is created by pretty much every economic actor at various times in their life. Households, workers, businesses, even Wall Street companies have a lot of debt. Household debt itself is 14 trillion. I didn't look up the corporate debt, but that's also well up into the trillions. Private debt is also very large in the economy, and most often, if you look throughout history, if you're studying business cycles and financial crises, typically it's private debt is at the crux of the problem and not the public debt. So private debt is something that you need to realize is also very large, and it's often at the center or the core of explaining financial crises, and it's not the public debt that is. And the basic reason is that private debt has more risk associated with it. All right, second principle there is assets versus liabilities. Typically, when we talk about national debt, only one side of the government's balance sheet is talked about. For those who have worked with balance sheets, or you've drawn up your own balance sheets, or your financial advisor has done that for you, right? There's two sides. There's the assets and the liabilities, but typically when it comes to the federal national debt, for some reason, people are only talking about the one side of the balance sheet, and that's the debt side or the liability side. But if you know some accounting or econ or finance, the liabilities fund the assets, right? So just like in our own cases, if you went out to buy a home, most people have to take out a mortgage loan. The mortgage loan is your liability, but the house is the asset. The liability funds the asset. Well, it's the same way for the government. So the government borrows, they sell bonds, that's a liability. The accumulated deficits are the debt, but the government gets a lot, the public gets a lot for those liabilities. We call those assets. They may be tangible or they may be intangible. Tangible assets are public land, defense products, infrastructure, but there's also a lot of intangible kinds of assets, like our social programs, the social insurance, the poverty programs, and then you have the kind of in-between, tangible and service kind of assets, say with public education or environmental regulations and programs. So we own a lot, that's our assets, because we have a lot of liabilities. The public sector wouldn't own much if it didn't have any liabilities. So the assets go hand in hand with the liabilities. And then the third principle, the third of the five, is shown at the bottom of the same slide here, households versus government in terms of currencies, currency users and issuers. Well, everybody in the economy is a currency user, right? Households, workers, businesses, and governments are currency users. However, the national government, if it's completely sovereign and independent as ours is not just simply a currency user, but it's a currency issuer. Right? All modern money is connected to the nation state. So you have the American dollar, the Canadian dollar, the Mexican peso, the British pound, right, and the Japanese yen. All money is connected to sovereign national government. So there's an interconnection there between an independent state and the money that the society is using in that state. Now, the European Monetary Union would represent a real unique contemporary divergence. So Germany and France and Italy, countries like that, they've given up their currency to their central bank. They're not in control of it anymore. But that's a rather unusual, though current, situation. But most national governments are like ours. They have a lot of fiscal freedom because they're not just using the currency, but they're in charge of creating it. The key there is that the government works with its central bank, right? There's got to be a cooperation between those two entities. So one more point there with respect to the third principle. Any sovereign government that is in control of its currency cannot default. Right? The federal government of the United States can buy anything it wants because it's in control of its own currency. It cannot default except by choice. Right? The Congress could choose to default. There could be a political reason driving the default, but there's no financial reason, right, to create a default. Unlike you and me with the home mortgage or a car loan or a business loan, right? I mean, those defaults are certainly things that we have seen throughout our economic history. All right, next slide, Amy. It starts, it says government cash, negative cash flow at top. This is principle number 4. The government's negative cash flow is equal to the private sector's positive cash flow. Now, we'll come back to that. I want to get down to the 2 ideas or themes stated at the bottom of that slide. Interdependency and dollars must flow somewhere. Let's talk about those, and then we'll backtrack up to principle 4. Right, the economy is highly interdependent. We really all know that from our experiences. Everybody's got a cash flow. So when consumers spend, they affect business income. And when businesses pay us, we get money. Banks affect consumers. Banks affect businesses through their loans and deposits. Everybody's connected. Well, that's the same way with the government. Federal government's integrated into the economy as well. They have a cash flow. So when they spend, that affects private income. When they tax us, that also affects our income, right? So all that is integrated. The government's integrated into the economy. Another way of saying what I just said is that all dollars have to flow somewhere, right? So when we buy goods at Home Depot, that's Home Depot's income. If we work for Home Depot, they use some of that income to pay our wages, right? So all money must go somewhere. Another way to put it is everybody's income is somebody else's spending. Everybody's income is somebody else's spending, right? So we're all connected. So that takes us back to the principle shown at the top of the current slide. To understand how the government's cash flow is connected to the private sector, let's imagine the following situation. Let's imagine that the government is running a balanced budget. So it's spending an amount of money equal to its income. And let's say the private sector is doing the same thing, right? So we can imagine that. The private sector is spending an amount of money equal to its income. So let's start off that way.
Hey, William,
Yeah.
Doctor, we're getting a little short on time here. So, so I'm going to have to ask you to kind of move into the last slide.
Okay, sure. I can, if there's any questions on that principle, I can do that by email. So let's go to, does the government have to pay off its debt? The answer is no. The only thing that the government has to do is to pay off the debt that comes due each month, right? There's bonds that come due each month, and the government does have to make good on that. But it doesn't have to pay down or pay off the whole debt. It never has to do that. If it were to do that, it would be a highly contractionary policy because it would have to raise taxes substantially or cut spending, right? You would have to create a budget surplus in order to have the proceeds to pay down the debt. And that would have a highly contractionary effect on the private economy, right? Our taxes would go way up or the spending would go way down or both, and you would be in a depression. There's nothing forcing the government to pay off its debt. And so the answer to that is no, it doesn't have to pay off its entire debt. You could do that by choice, but that would be a poor policy choice. So that takes us to questions. So next slide, questions. Notice the internet links there, so please view those and read those for more information. So, okay, questions.
If anyone has questions, we'll post. Oh, there's one in here. That is, why then do the state and municipal government have to balance their budgets?
Yeah, they have to balance their budgets either because of city law or state law or state constitutions. That's a purposely self-imposed restriction onto the spending of those entities. Plus, remember what I said earlier, everybody's a currency user. The only currency issuer is the federal government. So the government in Florida, the state government in Florida, cannot create money. So it is beholden to spending what it can raise. And that's not true with the federal government.
Okay, thanks, William. Everyone, we'll post William's email address. And if you have further questions, you can contact him. Thanks a million. We appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome. I enjoyed it.